Okay.
throwing him?
No, you're good.
Okay.
You're good for now. Yeah. Just a warning, everybody. Joe may have some technical difficulties. As you can see, he's pleasing us aesthetically by being outside. So, welcome back, Joe, and then welcome first time to the channel, Dr. Alex Malpast. Dr. Malpast, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Yeah, so a little bit of backstory. As if any of you have seen the video Joe and I recently did, well, the video was a collective project. The presentation contained within the video was Joe's, basically entirely Joe's thing. So we did a video on that recently. One of the slides we used one of Dr. Malpass's objections to the fine-tuning argument. And so I believe you got in contact with Joe after that about coming on to talk to us about this paper. Is that roughly more or less what happened?
Yeah, somebody messaged me and said that that you guys had made a video and called an argument, named an argument after me. So I'm naturally curious to see what that was about. And so yeah, and then I enjoyed the content, and then I figured it might be. I thought that you had lots of like smart things to say about the stuff that you were dealing with. So it was good quality discussion, and I figured it would be nice to talk about the piece of work that I just finished. So yeah, I thought it would be a nice platform to just come on and have a discussion about that and see what you thought as well. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate it. And see, Joe, geez, funny enough, after that call, like a recording call ended, Joe was actually like kind of self-conscious about some of his names for those arguments. So, see, Joe, you had no reason to be worried. It actually worked out fantastically. So you were worried about it after that. So don't doubt yourself. That's the message of this. Okay, so the paper we're going to be discussing and the arguments within our paper you co-wrote with Dr. Wes Morriston on the Kalam cosmological argument, specifically, I think, some of Craig's motivations for the second premise arguing against a beginningless past infinite, right? So the paper kind of targets some of Craig's, I think, symmetry breakers. So if you want, you can go ahead. If you want to go ahead and lay out kind of the general scheme of the paper and kind of what we'll be talking about. What do you think the most relevant stuff is? And then we can just kind of go from there naturally.
Sure.
See what happens.
Okay, so so the Kalam obviously is a cosmological argument that is intended to show that the universe has a cause for its existence. And as you say, the second premise, so the first premise is something like everything that begins to exist has a cause. The second premise says the universe began to exist. And then the conclusion is the universe has a cause, right? So then we're just looking at the second premise, which is that the universe began to exist. And Craig offers scientific arguments for that conclusion and also philosophical arguments for that conclusion. So we're not going to look at the scientific arguments. We're just focusing on one of the two philosophical arguments, right? So the argument is the impossibility of actual infinites is the kind of name for it, right? And it basically just says if time had no beginning, then the past would constitute an actual infinite, right? And the second premise is an actual infinite cannot exist, and the conclusion is therefore time couldn't be infinite in the past, must have a beginning. And the reason for thinking that so the second premise there is what's controversial, right? I mean, why think that there couldn't be an actual infinite, right? Why think that that couldn't happen? And Craig's idea is exploits this property that that you get in some kind of set theory, right? Where a set which has infinitely many members is defined really as having this property, right? Which we can call Cantor's property. And that property is that you can line up, you can associate one-to-one every single element in the set with proper subsets of that set. So the classic example here is you can show that there is a one-to-one relation between, say, the natural numbers and the even numbers, right? Even though the even numbers is obviously a proper subset of the natural numbers, and intuition tells you that there's fewer even numbers than there are natural numbers, half as many, right? But that you can show that there's actually the same number, right? You can pair them off one-to-one with each other. So that property is the kind of thing that Craig uses to motivate sort of strange scenarios with, right? So any collection that was like existed in reality, kind of concrete collection of real things that had that property, you can start to cook up crazy sounding scenarios with it, right? Like Hilbert's Hotel or the Infinite Library or whatever. So everybody knows this Hilbert's Hotel one, right? There's a hotel with infinitely many rooms in. Each room has a guest in already. Somebody comes up to the front desk and says to the manager, "Have you got a room?" And he says, "Well, we're full, but yeah, we can fit you in." He just makes everybody shuffle up one room. Everybody goes to a new room. There's a room for everybody who's already there, but that frees up room number one for the guests to come into, right? So even though they were full, they've got a room. And that's kind of weird. Obviously, that's kind of weird. And Craig motivates the idea that, things in the real world don't have that property, right? They have the kind of contrary property to that, which is sometimes called Euclid's maxim, which is the idea that the whole is always greater than the proper part, right? But in infinite contexts, right, the whole can be kind of equivalent to the proper part. So basically, Craig thinks Euclid's maxim is true for all concretely existing things, and if it wasn't true, then you'd have these weird these weird scenarios where stuff would be odd. Like you could take a book off the library, but there's still just as many books on the shelf or whatever. And I do find it hard to take some of those examples particularly seriously because I just think in some cases it's just kind of weird and there's not much else to say about it. I don't really find them that troubling. It's not the same as saying straightforwardly that you've got two propositions that are contradictory or something.
Right.
Some versions of those types of paradoxes, like the Tristram Shandy version of that paradox, is a bit more difficult to kind of understand or like so know what to say about. But some of them are less troubling.
Okay. Yes.
Sorry, I heard a voice there, but I think maybe it was my voice coming through a speaker rather than.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So anyway, right, we've got this second premise, which is that the universe began to exist, and it's motivated by the idea that, well, if there was an infinite number of like previous events, then they would be like a concrete instantiation of an actual infinite in the same way, right? Like this, there would already have to be an infinite number of days that have already happened, say, but at the end of today, one more day will be in the collection of days that had already happened. But how many days are there now? The same number as there was yesterday, right? Even though I've added one to it, it hasn't gone up in number, it's the same, right? So what we're looking at is Cantor's property again. Like, yes, the number of days yesterday that were passed is a proper subset of the number of days that have passed today, even though that's actually equinumerous with each other. And so the idea is supposed to be if time was infinite in the past, it would behave in the same sort of weird way as Hilbert's Hotel. And the kind of basic idea that response to this is to say, well, I mean, okay, so if that's weird, wouldn't it also be weird if the future has no end? I mean, doesn't this just symmetrically apply to the future as well as the past? I mean, say the future has no end, then it seems like there's an infinite number of days yet to be, right? That will happen at some point. And after today, there'll still be an infinite number of days yet to be, even though one of them is no longer future and is now sort of present or past, right? But even so, there's the same number there, right? So it's got Cantor's property as well. It's like a guest leaving Hilbert's Hotel, and you say, well, there's still just as many guests in Hilbert's Hotel, right? So if it's weird, if the weirdness rules out the past being infinite, it should rule out the future being infinite too, right? So it seems like you've just got this kind of symmetry consideration that says what's good for the goose is good for the gander or whatever, right? So, and that might be okay, right? That doesn't you might just accept that, bite the bullet. But typically, Christian theists will suppose that after their mortal life, there is a never-ending life, right? In whether that's a good set of experiences or bad, it's a never-ending series of experiences. Now, not everybody's view of the afterlife is like that, of course. Some people don't think of it as a never-ending sequence of experiences, but for those who do, they're in a bit of a bind, right? Because how do they maintain their belief? Well, if they believe the universe came into existence and that Craig's philosophical argument here is motivates that, then why doesn't that also clash with their like all other belief that time continues without end, right? So it should apply either to both the past and the future, or neither, right? What you can't do is seem to pick and mix and have like a finite past and an infinite future if this is your argument, because it seems to apply symmetrically. So if you what you want to do is have that asymmetric account of time where the past has a beginning but the future has no end, then what you need to do if you want to run this argument is find some kind of symmetry breaker between the past and the future, right? Some reason why the argument applies to the past but it doesn't apply to the future. And that's what the paper is about, right? Craig has offers various different types of potential symmetry breakers, like reasons for thinking that the past is different to the future, such that this argument rules out the infinite past but doesn't rule out the infinite future. And what we do in the paper is go through them effectively one by one, explaining why we don't think those like attempts at producing a symmetry breaker are successful, and that what we think at the end is whatever you say about the past in this context applies to the future in the same way, right? So that's basically the outline of the paper. Yeah, okay, I'll pause to see if that seems right to you guys.
Yeah, sounds good. Joe, everything good?
Yeah, I think that's a good outline of the paper. So, I mean, one thing I'm wondering is that, is it that bad for, Craig and others to just bite the bullet and, say that, yeah, I agree that, there can't be an endless future, but, let's just say that the afterlife is a sort of, timeless state of existence or a state of beatitude or union with God. And certain elements of Catholic theology, I mean, if you look in the Catholic Catechism, it does describe it as a state of union with God and with Christ. So, I mean, I'm wondering if they can say that it's more so like a state of being than an endless future, an everlasting, succession. So I'm wondering if we can pause on that just a little bit and discuss that.
It's one of the questions I had too, yeah.
Okay, so that's a good question, and I don't have a huge amount to say about that, apart from to say something like this, right? That to the extent that the afterlife is like qualitatively different to what's the opposite of afterlife? Life, right? To the extent that it's different, right? It makes it it kind of makes, well, how do I say this? Okay, so if you've got the idea in your head that the afterlife is basically like living, right, one thing after another, a sequence of experiences that happens to you, right, then it's easy to understand how, say, identity is preserved, because it's just like being alive, right? How is it? Well, I mean, it's no more problematic than identity when you're alive, right? It's just one thing happening after another or something, and it's easy then to sort of pin on a sense of like expectation in a good way, right? Like anticipation of it being good or bad, right? Like I understand what it means if it's like one thing after another, like ice cream every day and it's always sunny and everything's cool or whatever. Like, good, I want that to happen. That sounds fun. Let's do that. Or if it's like bad people poking you and it's all horrible and stuff, I understand why that's bad and I don't want that to happen, and fair play, right? Like it fits into a psychology of I guess something to look forward to or to try and avoid, right? Which is basically the role that it plays in many people's understandings. But if it's some kind of like timeless union with whatever, like what is that, and how am I supposed to understand that in such a way that I can realistically look forward to it? Like, and what does it mean to have like one never-ending experience? Like, how is that distinct from not having any experience at all, right? Like, it's just sort of difficult to understand. It's difficult to get like jazzed up about the idea of that happening, right? Like, I don't really even if that's what's coming, I'm not sure if it's something I should like feel like I'm looking forward to or not, because I just can't place it within any of my it doesn't fit in my kind of psychological geography. I don't know where that goes. So I mean, it's not that you can't bite the bullet there, but what you might find if you do bite the bullet is that your conception of the afterlife is radically different from life, in such a way that you might find it doesn't play the role anymore of being sort of stuff to look forward to or be afraid of anymore. Right? I think that's my main. I don't have much more to say about it than that, though.
Yeah, that's understandable. I mean, it might be understood as a piece of sort of apophatic theology. It's just sort of like a negative claim. Like, it's sort of beyond us at this point. Like, we're so bound up with our corporeality that it's going to be, we should expect it to be on our understanding, as it were. But I mean, maybe we could look to like the phenomenology of religious experiences, perhaps. I mean, some people say that they might lose track of time. They don't really have a succession of mental states. They just sort of, I don't know. There might be certain religious experience elements that we could draw in here. I mean, I've never had one, and presumably you guys haven't either, or something along those lines. But I think that might be interesting, an avenue to explore for that.
Yeah, I basically had like the same questions. It's good we covered that earlier. I just basically had the question of like what eschatological time would look like and whether or not it's relevant. So even if it's not a temporal state, I mean, because we make sense of time and temporal succession within like this spatio-temporal manifold. So, presumably in the eschaton, there's kind of this either destruction by God or renewal of the universe. So it's if in what sense, because the way we make sense of time is obviously within kind of our natural universe or whatever you want to call it. So in a post physical universe existence, I mean, if there is temporal succession, my other question was like, what would that even look like? But I do also wonder whether or not it's relevant, because again, for someone like Craig, he's a presentist. Like, does he think presentism is going to carry over into the afterlife? Because, like, for example, Joe, your point there, like, if Craig thinks presentism is going to carry over to the afterlife, obviously he can't have that like one eternal moment with God, because that's flies in the face of. So I do wonder if like the philosophy of time, how that applies to the afterlife and whether or not it's relevant. I mean, maybe it's not. Maybe we can just say like, well, there's temporal succession, but it's different, so we can still talk about potential infinites. But I'm not sure. So if you guys have anything else on that, yeah.
So I guess what I said, I didn't have much else to say. I think now I'm started speaking about it, maybe I do have at least one other thing to say about it, which is that I guess, I mean, one way of looking at it is like, what does it mean to have conscious experience that's not temporal succession, right? That's not one thing after another. Like, even if I'm having a dream, it's basically still a sequence of like weird images and feelings or whatever that happens one after another. Like the idea of just having like one sensation forever, and it's not a sequence, it's not even like lots of increments of the same thing happening over time or something, they're just being one experience. It just feels like it's hard to know how that's distinguishable from not having anything, no experience or whatever. Like I don't know. So I kind of question whether it even makes sense to be. This is why I was saying there's some challenging about the idea of like identity, like surviving into that context. It's so radically different that a basic level survival requires there's a continuous succession of a sequence of things that are tied together with the same kind of subject experiencing them. And it's hard to know what to make of identity if that basic framework is gone. So, I mean, it's not like I'm saying you can't say anything about that. Maybe you could, but a lot of people don't want to go there, and it's not their idea of the afterlife. And it's not, if you a Buddhist or something, and maybe has this like idea of nirvana, and it's not like that. I mean, maybe cool. Then you're not in trouble with this argument. That's fine. It's only if you do think that, and I think Craig does think that. Frankly, I mean, he doesn't bite the bullet. Nowhere in the literature does he say, but I don't have that view of the afterlife or whatever. In fact, he's hunting around for symmetry breakers for like 20 years or whatever. So it feels like he does. That's his view. So it doesn't matter even if someone else isn't in trouble. Yeah. He's in trouble. Like, that's the idea with this.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Do you have anything else you want to say there, Joe? That's an interesting point. Good there. Okay. Was there anything else in the paper you needed to spell out before we dove into some of the points? I mean, we kind of already got into one, but is there anything else we needed to like overlay?
No, let's go.
Okay, perfect. Well, one thing, I guess I'll just start off with something pretty simple that like, it's kind of when Craig gives these arguments like Craig's Library or Hilbert's Hotel, Joe and I have talked about this before. What he's doing there is he's transfinite arithmetic and like the manipulation of infinite sets. But the move he makes there that's not really justified, for one thing, is moving from manipulation of infinities to saying that actual infinites can't exist, right? Because it's there's a disanalogy there. Like, an actual infinite doesn't entail that there's causally interactive. So that's why, as we mentioned earlier, like the causal finitist versions of the Kalam are like the ones that are generally better, because they kind of go off of this causal principle. But with this, I mean, Craig says you can't manipulate an actual infinity, therefore actual infinities can't exist. And it's like that doesn't follow at all for me. It's like we could have an actual infinite that's just like not causally interactive. We're not taking or adding numbers away. Do you have anything? What's up, Joe?
Yeah. So I wanted to add that I mean, this is sort of alongside what one of his criticisms is that he's pointing out that, like, let's look at these scenarios like Hilbert Total. Let's try to ask, what is it about the scenario that is sort of spawning these absurdities? I mean, I can go with that. I mean, personally, I don't think there are absurdities in there, but what's spawning these absurdities? And when you look at Hilbert Total, it's not the mere existence of an infinite amount of rooms or an infinite amount of guests. It's when you start manipulating it causally in some manner or other, right? So, so that's what's really spawning the apparent absurdities. Without that, the absurdities don't really arise, as it were. But if we look at the past, I mean, we can't like causally manipulate the past. We can't move around and shift around the past so as to generate these sorts of paradoxes. The past is, as it were, fixed, at least indexed from now, you know? Now, I know Craig tries to give like a sort of mental manipulation version of it, or like counterfactual manipulation version of it, which I think you successfully, you know, defer, or whatever, you successfully rebut it in your paper, but you know, it's one relevant disanalogy between Hilbert Total and past events that Oppie and others have pointed out. So I wanted to add to that. I wanted to add to yours and clarify that.
Yeah. Okay. So the objection there is that you know, with Hilbert's Hotel, right, the issue is that the guests move around for there to be any absurdity, like that it's full, but that there's room, or that there's, you know, the same amount of guests, even though one more has arrived, right? They have to do something for it to look weird. Otherwise, it's just there's loads of guests or something, and that's not weird enough. Okay, and then you might say, well, look, the past is the past, right? There's nothing you can, you can't. So one way of looking at this is that you say Craig thinks that there's a problem in transfinite arithmetic. Well, it's not a problem, but the subtraction is left undefined. It's not an operation that's usually added in to transfinite arithmetic, and his idea is that the reason that that's so is because you can get inconsistent results, right? So you could say, you know, take the set of natural numbers and minus, you know, remove all of those that are greater than 3, right? How many have you removed? You've removed infinity. So it's like infinity minus infinity equals 3, right? But now get the set and minus all of the even numbers, right? So it's still an infinity that you're taking away. So it's infinity minus infinity, but you've still got infinity left because there's all of the odd numbers, and has the same cardinality as the whole did. So sometimes infinity minus infinity is 3, sometimes infinity minus infinity is infinity, and that's inconsistent because 3 doesn't equal infinity, right? So you know, it leads you to a contradiction or whatever. And you know, you could say, well, look, you can't like subtract elements from the past, right? Like the past is fixed and there's nothing anybody can do about. That's kind of metaphysical fact that everything that's happened has happened, and there's no like taking them away once they've happened. But Craig says of that objection in particular, he says we can still compare, for example, the number of odd numbered events with the total number of events, or the number of events prior to day with the number of events prior to any day in the past, and mentally add and subtract events so as to obtain the same absurdities. So what he's saying is that you can just imagine, what if, you know, no events earlier than the last 3 happened, right? And mentally subtract them from the total. Or what if only half of the events happened, every other event didn't happen, and mentally add and subtract those things. So you don't have to have realistically a causal interactive setting. He thinks it's enough to demonstrate the absurdity as long as it's possible for you to mentally add and subtract. But then the problem there is that obviously you can do that with the future too, right? Like I could just imagine that every other event that will happen doesn't happen, right? And mentally subtract those from the set of events that will happen. How many have I got? Well, I've still got the same amount as I did in the first place, right? So it's, again, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. There's no reason you know, as far as what I'm able to mentally add and subtract, right? That's obviously not asymmetric. It's perfectly symmetric. So that that objection that you can't alter the past, Craig has a rebuttal to it, but it obviously fails, right? It just obviously fails to address this point. It's not a symmetry breaker, right? So that's one of the rabbit holes that just seems super easy to just say that's not going to work, right?
And that's if we get on board with it being absurd at all in the first place. I mean, as you point out in the paper, and as other authors have pointed out, and as I myself argue as well, with one of our friends, and Micah, as you know, in our group, is that it's not really a contradiction, right? Because it depends. What it shows us, and as you point this out in the paper, what it shows us is really that the result at the end depends, as it were, on the manner or mode that we subtract. Depends on whether we the set that we take out. Are we taking out 3 and above, or are we taking out every odd number? And I know Felipe Leon touches on this in his book with Josh Rasmussen. And we shouldn't conclude that it's like a contradictory. We just conclude that the result depends on the way you do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, we talked about identifying which numbers you're taking away is really crucial. And I think you guys covered the the different inputs. I don't know if you want to talk about that at all, like the different input functions for set theory. If you want to kind of go over that, what's up?
You can explain the functions one. I love that. I love how you can sort of mirror the 2 different types of infinities by the functions, and that was sort of central to some of your arguments. So if you could go over that, I thought that was really useful.
Okay, so then we're talking about section 2, which is, I mean, most of the time, the most sort of obvious attempt at a symmetry breaker that Craig does is to say, well, look, the infinite past would be an actual infinite, whereas the infinite future would only be a potential infinite, right? And that the one of those, the actual infinite, is the one that has all the contradictory or strange properties, right? This Cantor's property. But the potential infinite doesn't have Cantor's property, right? And so therefore it's not problematic to say if that distinction held, then none of the Hilbert's Hotel style weird consequences would affect the future, even though it has no end, but they would all affect the infinite past. So that would be one way of providing a symmetry breaker, right? If one's potentially infinite and the other's actually infinite. So what does he mean by potentially infinite? I mean, first of all, an actual infinite, as we said, is just any set or collection where you can line up the whole of it with proper parts of it, right? That's it. That's what the definition is. What does a potential infinite mean, right? Now, this is more problematic, and actually, there's no canonical definition for this in the literature, right? There's philosophy of mathematics doesn't have a settled view on this. There are people working on this today that play around with different ideas, and there are philosophers of mathematics who are skeptical that there is a different notion here at all, right? It goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle's idea is different from Craig's, though, and not everything, it's just not clear, right? So Craig's got his own idiomatic idea of it, and I won't spend too time going into Aristotle's idea, but it's in some ways substantially different from Craig's. Craig's idea basically boils down to something like this, right? That a potential infinite is something which is increasing, right? It's changing. It's remaining finite throughout all of its changes, and there's no greatest extent to which it can increase, right? So another way of saying that is that it's approaching infinity as a limit that it never actually reaches. It's always getting closer towards it, but never actually getting there. So it's a potential infinite has these 3 properties, right? Growing, remaining infinite, and approaching infinity, but never getting there. Now, his idea is that the future is a potentially infinite because what's happening is that it's growing, right? And it's growing towards infinity, but it's never quite getting there. It's at every moment, it's always remaining finite. And there is something intuitive about that idea, right? It does strike a lot of people as right. I mean, it sort of feels like there's something that's right about that idea. But it's saying, you have to be very precise about explaining why that's not a symmetry breaker, right? And so here's the way that we do it in the paper anyway. And I'm not sure this is necessarily the easiest thing to explain without writing it down, but let's see if I can give it a go. So imagine you've got the natural numbers, the counting numbers from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, going up endlessly. So we're going to define a function, right? And all a function is, for people who are not into logic or whatever, it's just like an input-output machine, right? It takes some input and it spits out some output, right? And the input that it's going to take in is numbers, right? It's going to take single numbers as an input. And what it's going to give you as an output, this first function, it's going to give you everything that's less than or equal to the input, right? So if I put the number 5 in as the input, then the output is going to be a set of numbers. It's going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, right? So it's going to be a set that has 6 things in it. So if I put the number 1,000,000 in, it's going to have like 1,000,001 elements in that set, right? All of the numbers up from 0 up to and including 1,000,000. So you can see then with this function, no matter which number I put in, which element I put in of our natural numbers, the output's always going to be finite, right? It's never going to have more than finitely many elements in. It's always got between 0 and whatever element we put in the first place. But obviously, as the input increases, as we kind of steadily run through the series, increasing the input, the output is going to increase too, right? It's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. It's always going to be finite, but it's going to get bigger, and it's going to be kind of approaching infinity as a limit, but it's never going to get there. So this is a function that like characterizes the potential infinite in the sense that Craig has, in mind. Now let's contrast that with a different function. Let's sort of call that previous one the A function, right? So the B function, it's just going to be basically the same idea, but with a slight twist on it, right? So it's going to be a function that takes numbers as its input, and it's going to give you a set of numbers back as its output, right? But the set of numbers that it gives you back as its output is just going to be defined as all of the numbers that are greater than the input number. So if I put in the number 3, then the output that I get is a class of numbers that's like 3, 4, 5, 6, ... right up to endless, right? So it's going to be a class of numbers that's infinite, right? That a class of numbers such that you could line it up with the natural numbers and show that there was one-to-one relation between them, so that it gives you a set that's actually infinite. And that's actually infinite if my input to it is 3, or if my input to it is 100 million, or if my input to it is whatever. It doesn't matter. So first of all, the A function, whatever number I put into it, it's going to be finite, and it has no highest amount, right? But it can be growing if I increase the input. The second function, the output's going to be infinite, and it doesn't matter what I put in as the input, it stays the same, right? The output of any number is always the same, a set with the same cardinality. So what that shows you is just the potential infinite and the actual infinite, right? That's basically what's going on here. But then if we just take a step back and think about it, right? What I'm doing is I'm saying the first function just gives me every number that's greater than or equal to the input. And that's just like basically like saying the past, right? Like if I identified the numbers as times, I'm just saying at time t1 or at time t3, the A function gives me the times t0, t1, t2, and t3, right? It gives me all the times that have happened as of t3. Right? It's giving me the past. And what we're saying is that as time moves on, as the value of the input function goes up, the set of elements in the class of times that have already happened is increasing, right? So what's increasing like as a potential infinite over time, remaining finite, always growing, approaching infinity as a limit, is not the future, right? It's the past. So as time passes, more and more moments are in this like finite but ever growing set, right? Whereas in contrast to that, the future, which is like, and if you think about it, the set of times that are later than whatever time it is, that's the future, right? That set remains the same every time. Well, the cardinality of that set remains the same. It's always the same, no matter what time it is. There's always the same amount of times still to go, right? If the future has no end, right? It's always an infinite amount of times left, no matter how long you've been waiting for, right? You're no nearer the end of time because there is no end of time. Right? There's always an endless amount of future ahead of you. So what that just shows you is that if you want to talk about potential infinite, right, in the sense that Craig does, really, it's the past that's the potential infinite in this situation. And if you say, look, imagine there's somebody who's just counting numbers forever, right? And you say of this poor guy who has an endless task, how many numbers will you count, right? How many have you got left to count? It doesn't matter how many he's counted, he's always going to have the same number of numbers left that are in his future that he's going to count. And if you ask him how many numbers have you counted, then he'll be increasing those steadily. And that just shows you that like what's potentially infinite is not the endless future, right? There's no sense in which the future is, it's not growing, it's not approaching infinity as a limit, it's not finite, right? It just doesn't have any of the properties that Craig associates with the actual infinite. But in order to spell that out, you need to just be really clear. Like it just takes ages of going through, going, right, fuck it, let's just set up a function, let's do this mathematically, let's set the detail out. So it just seems to me that yeah, I mean, I think it was probably easier to understand that if you read the paper rather than me saying it out loud. I don't know if my explanation is cogent and you can understand what I'm saying when I say it out loud like that, or if maybe I'm losing everybody, Andy. I don't know.
No, that was really good. I feel like I understand it even better now. That was a really good explanation. Yeah, no, that was great. Cool. Yeah, that was a really interesting function to me too. That whole part of the paper. For some reason, it reminds me of the one infinity paradox, like the counting paradox. Like you just come upon somebody in the woods and they're like 3, 2, 1, 0, and it's like, what did you use? Like, oh, I just counted down from infinity, and that's one of the paradoxes Oppie covers in his book. So it reminded me of that for some reason. Mm-hmm. One question I had that's like really simple is we're talking about like the input values and like the output corresponding to that kind of. For either, it would probably be more so for the second function. But was there a way coherently to tell a story about like having an input value that's like an infinite set, or is there something like to where each input value has to be itself finite? Because in the examples you draw out there, both the input values are finite in a way. I mean, I guess the input of every number greater than 5 would kind of be, you'd get an infinity from that, but you're starting with like an increase. So is that the same as inputting an infinite, or could you input just like a completed set, or what would that entail?
So the definition of the function is that it's I mean, it's just a piece of mathematics, right? So it just has certain parameters, but all it's a function that's defined on a structure that's like the natural numbers. But then if time is discrete and it has a beginning and no end, then it's a structure that's like the natural numbers as well, right? So it's just as easily, you can just think about it being a function that takes times as its values rather than numbers if you want to. But then the way that it works is that it takes units, like single numbers, as the input, right? And there's no single number in the set of natural numbers that's infinity. That isn't a number as such. So, and it also doesn't take pairs of numbers or triples of numbers either. So it just takes input values are just single-digit numbers.
Oh, okay, I got you.
And then the output is a class of numbers, and that's given by a property, which in the first case was all those numbers less than or equal to the input. And in the second case, it's all those numbers greater than the input. So the output is a class, the input is a singleton of a number. That makes sense.
Oh, got it. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Okay, I'm sure we'll probably be on this point. This is one of the main points. So I want to hear what Joe has to think too. This kind of whole point about adding to the past. I thought that was really interesting. That whole idea of like, and it kind of made me think like, I don't know what. There are a couple questions. I'll save like a couple of them for later, but just for now, like, I have a couple questions about how Craig's even able to tell a coherent story about actual infinites of past events, given some of his views. But more so, I really like the point of like, how are we supposed to call it a completed infinite if we're constantly adding moments, or like if in the function it'd be numbers, like for every moment we experience, there's moments receding into the past. So we're constantly adding to what is the past, like the collection of past events. So it's not like we are able to cut it off and be like, okay, we start here and go back. It's like we have a completed infinity. Like, that's just not how it works. We're just constantly having this addition of numbers, but of course in this case they're moments or events or what have you. So I think that was a really important distinction there of like how it's really the past is the potential infinite that's growing and the future is kind of more constant. So
yeah, so just to be clear then, the past is a potential infinite only in the sense that if the past has a first moment, right?
Yeah.
And what happens is that one by one events become actual or whatever and get added to the pile that starts off with none in it, then it has 1 in it, then it has 2 in it, then it has 3. Right? As time is passing, it's increasing. So that requires that the assumption is that if time has no beginning and if time has a beginning and no end, and it just like the clock keeps ticking forever, then what you find is that the past is always finite, right? You were talking there a minute ago about an infinite past, right? Well, if the past has no beginning, then it wouldn't be potentially infinite, right? I mean, I totally concede that it would be an actual infinite, right? Because what you'd be saying there is there'd be one past event, let's say day, for each natural number, right? And that's what it is to be a completed infinity. Now, it stays the same. This is, Cantor's property again, right? But let's say the past has no beginning, right? And as of today, and that means that in principle, I could assign a natural number to each previous day that had happened, right? But then tomorrow ticks on and an extra day has been added to all of those past days, right? And then you might say, well, are there more past days now? Didn't we complete the set of or one for each natural number? Isn't that completed? How can there be any more added to the pile? But actually, you can just assign a natural number to each of those past days again, even though there's sort of more of them. You can still assign one natural number to each of them again and find, oh, there's just like the same number again, right? Even though I've added one to the pile, it hasn't actually got any bigger. So it's still completed, even though you add one to it, right? That's what's weird about actual infinity. It doesn't like play the rules that natural intuition thinks things play by. That's how it can be completed.
So it's not problematic in the same way Hilbert's Hotel is really not problematic.
Well, I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, it's no more or less problematic than that. It's the same feature, in fact.
Yeah, I thought so. All right, Joe, did you have anything on this point? I'm sure you have a couple questions if you turn. There you go. What do you got?
Yeah. So I'm wondering, about completing the infinite. So I know you do touch on this in the paper, and maybe we can, expound on it further. One potential symmetry breaker is just that maybe Craig could say, while I do equivocate between will be versus will have been, maybe we should just focus on will have been. Maybe we should just focus on that and say that, okay, well, it's impossible that, there will have been an infinite, right? But if the past was infinite, right, in extent, if the past was beginningless, then it's true that there, would have been, because, we've already sort of traversed it, as it were. But in the future, while I'm speaking for Craig, while I agree that there will be an infinite future, an endless future, it is false, as you seem to recognize, that there will have been an infinite number of events. So I'm wondering if he can just say, I agree that I'm equivocating there, but I'm just going to start talking only about will have been, or what has been completed. And maybe that's where he's going to try to insert the impossibilities. So I'm wondering what you think about that. And I know you do touch on this a bit in the paper. So,
well, I mean, it depends how to take that point. But so one way of thinking about that is that you say, look, I mean, for a start, if it feels like the way you set that up is that this is premised on him saying, okay, well, there is an infinite number of events that are going to happen. I mean, and it feels to me that's game over then, right? Already, that's all I'm really interested in trying to establish, right? I mean, if he conceded that, then that's the point that I'm trying to get him to concede. So fine, but then let's say he just says, well, I've got a kind of aesthetic preference for the future perfect tense rather than the simple future tense, and I could say, okay, that's fine, but there is also a past perfect tense too, right? Like I could say, if that is helpful if it has any ontological significance that you just prefer to talk about things as they will have been, then I can say of past events, at t minus 10, right? I'll talk about that in the past perfect tense and talk about how many events were going to be at that point, right? And take this starting point now, like t0, no matter how it's even in a past that has no beginning, no matter which point I pick in the past, obviously the interval between now and that point in the past, like let's say I pick a point in the past that was like last Wednesday or whatever, there's a finite amount of time between now and last Wednesday. And I could say how many days were going to be from last Wednesday up until now, and there'll be some finite number, some n, which is finite. And it doesn't matter any time that I pick in the endless past, right? There's no time in the endless past that's so far away that the distance between it and now is greater than some finite number n, right? There's no time which is more than infinitely far away in the past, or at least there's no reason to suppose that there is, right? The defender of the beginningless past doesn't need to suppose that. So, and in that case, then an aesthetic preference for talking about the future perfect tense is mirrored by, and somebody could have an aesthetic preference for talking about the past perfect tense, right? And I mean, like, so what, right? That's not a symmetry breaker again, right? So on that kind of, tense is symmetrical, basically. There's no like purely tense logical symmetry breaker. So you have to do something more than point to tense. What you have to do is kind of incorporate some kind of ontological claim with that too, and say there's something ontologically significant about the future perfect tense that's not captured by the past perfect tense. And then I'm all ears, right? What's that?
Yeah. So I think that's good. It's like I know your discussion with Josh Rasmussen, you guys were talking about how we need some sort of relevant difference between these in order to break that symmetry. I mean, if you really think about it, many philosophical debates are just trying to find relevant differences between two things. So it's really interesting to see connections with that in other areas. But I'm wondering, maybe Craig would just have to say, like, if he's trying to find that ontological difference, maybe he's going to have to give up on like the sort of Hilbert's Hotel and the mere existence of an actual infinite, because now we're sort of switching to it's being completed, right? We're switching to it's being have been, it's the will have been, that perfect tense, the future perfect tense. So I'm guessing he's going to have to say, like, okay, fine, it's not just an actual infinite that's the problem. I guess it's some sort of, a traversal and then a completion. But now he's sort of conceded that philosophical argument doesn't work, and he's going to have to go to that other philosophical argument from traversing an actual infinite or something along those lines.
Well, okay, so that's a separate argument, and it's not one that we explicitly address in the paper we're talking about, but it is one that we're thinking about at the moment. And okay, so when it comes, so this is a bit more unsettled of what my view is, right? But Craig's idea here is in the traversing the actual infinite idea. So the idea is it's not possible to traverse an actual infinite, and you'd have to traverse the whole of it in order to arrive at now, right? And now is happening, right? And if it wasn't possible to get here without traversing an actual infinite, and traversing an actual infinite is possible, then there's your reductio, right? Couldn't be that there was an actual infinite that needed to be traversed. That's basically the argument. But you might say, well, why can't you traverse an actual infinite, right? Like, what's the deal with that? Why is that impossible? And basically, Craig's argument is that you can't count to infinity, right? And so if and then so they go, okay, well, imagine somebody who starts counting now, right? Let's call him George, and George starts counting 1, 2, 3, blah blah blah, and let's just stipulate that George never stops counting. And the question is, well, will George count to infinity? And Craig thinks that the answer has to be no, right? And that the reason is because, well, the way he puts it in his book and in the Companion to Natural Theology, because he has this like 100-page paper in the Companion to Natural Theology on the Kalam, the way he puts it in those two places is that Aleph naught, right? Aleph 0 is the kind of name or whatever for the smallest infinite number, right? The number that's greater than any finite number, the first number that's greater than any finite number. And as Craig points out, kind of correctly in a way, that number's not the successor of any number, right? There's no finite number n which comes before it. Sorry, I didn't hear that, Joe.
Yeah, categorically different. Like it's not like a successor of it. It's almost in another category, as it were.
Yeah, right. It's not in the it's not a natural number, right? It's a different type of number. That's right. So there's no number that comes before Aleph naught, right? It just is the one that comes after all of the natural numbers collectively. And Craig's like saying, well, when you're counting, what you're doing is you're announcing the next number, the one that comes after the one you've just said, right? And if that's all you're doing, then you're never going to say Aleph naught, because that doesn't come after any number, and it doesn't come immediately after any number. So how are you going to get there? And you might say, well, okay, I guess that proves that you can't count to infinity. And it kind of does, but then it kind of doesn't in the same way. Well, so Fred Dretske has his paper in 65 called Counting to Infinity, and he says you can count to infinity. And his argument is basically, say George just counts forever and he doesn't stop. Well, let's just say George starts counting and he doesn't stop. Then it's true that George counts every number n, right? For every number n, it's true that George will count that number, right? But that just means that all of the natural numbers are such that each one of them is going to be counted by George at some point or another. And then if you ask, well, how many natural numbers is it that George is going to count? And the cardinality of that set is Aleph naught, right? That's how many numbers he'll count, right? The cardinality of all of the finite numbers is Aleph naught, right? It's not a finite number. It's the first infinite number, right? In fact, that's the definition of Aleph naught. So in Dretske's sense, George will count to infinity because George will complete an infinite number of individual counting events eventually. But there won't ever be a point at which he says any number that's not a finite number, right? So he never says Aleph naught. It's just that the cardinality of the events of him announcing numbers is equal to Aleph naught. And so it just means that there's actually two senses of counting to infinity. One of them is, you've said all of the natural numbers and now you've moved on to another number, right? And Craig's saying that's not going to happen. But Dretske's just saying, well, if all you do is count natural numbers, then what you do is count an infinite number of numbers, right? So they're just two different things. And then the question is just, well, which one of them is relevant to the infinite past? Now, let's imagine that there's an infinite number of events in the past, and let's assign a number to each one of them, right? A unique number to each one of them. I don't have to assign Aleph naught to any of them, right? There's just one event for each number. How many events are there? Aleph naught many numbers, right? That's how many there are. But there isn't one that has the number Aleph naught assigned to it. Or think about Hilbert's Hotel, right? How many rooms are there in Hilbert's Hotel? There's Aleph naught many rooms, right? But there's no room number such that it's got Aleph naught on the outside, right? Each room number has a finite number on the outside, right? There's no infinitieth room. There's just each number is a finite number. So if Hilbert's Hotel is an infinite hotel, then it doesn't need that extra one on the end, right? It's already infinite. And if that's enough, then it's not clear exactly why, even if you can't do what Craig says you can't do, that means that you can't count to infinity. It just seems like you kind of can, right? It's just you need to be clear about whether we're talking about an ordinal number or a cardinal number. In terms of the cardinality of your counting, you do kind of count an infinite number. In terms of the ordinal numbers that you actually name, then you don't, right? You just name finite numbers. So it's this kind of classic ordinal cardinal distinction that we need to bring in. But once we've got that in place, it's like relatively straightforward, it seems to me. And you kind of just can traverse an actual infinite, right? I mean, another way of looking at it is like there's no let's say I can traverse in principle any finite duration of time, right? Well, there's no time that's so far away that the like interval between that and now is more than a finite time. So in principle, I can traverse all of the intervals I need to, right? Like show me the interval I can't traverse. And you can't do that because all of them are finite. It's just only taken collectively that there's an Aleph naught many points that you need to cross. So anyway, it's a subtle. I mean, it's a subtle thing. It requires a little bit of understanding of infinite mathematics, right? Transfinite mathematics. But it seems to me that when you do that, and you're careful enough to spell it out properly, that certainly the force of the argument is sucked away. I'm not saying that it's like completely has its ass kicked, but like it's not quite so clear now that like to begin with, you're like, yeah, sure, I'm not going to say that number, right? That definitely won't count that. But then when you realize, do I even need to say it? I'm not sure I need to say it. Like, I mean, then it just like everything's up in the air and it's not clear really if that's a devastating argument at all. It might be that it's just sort of posed on a confusion about ordinality and cardinality. And I mean, I don't think that's right. I mean, Craig's not stupid and he's not unaware of these things. And actually, his book's a really cool introduction to Cantorian concepts and stuff. I mean, I recommend it. It's a really good read. But yeah, I don't really like the argument. It doesn't seem to me a great argument. I don't know. I'm waffling. It's just something I've been thinking about at the moment, you see. So if you get me started talking about that, then carried away.
Yeah, no, it's good. Look forward to seeing what you guys come up with on that. Joe, did you have any more? I mean, that was kind of your question. You have any more clarification or other points along those lines?
Yeah, I'm wondering if that intuition almost rests, as it were, on starting at a definite point and then successively going from that point and so on. But, if there's a beginningless past, we're not starting at a given point and then, reversing from that one point and infinite. Now, granted, we do have this one point and then extending backwards. But I'm wondering if the absurdity or, the intuitive incoherence of it, if there is any, I'm wondering if that applies to the past, because it's not as though we're starting at some point in the past and then, we're counting forward and completing an infinite that way. I guess someone could count down, and somehow, and then arrive at 0 or 1 today. But I'm wondering if the intuition carries it.
Well, I think in that case, if you take someone who's counting down, right, then the thing that Craig was pointing to before, which was that you have to somehow state a number which isn't the successor of any other number. Like when you're counting down, explain to me at what point I need to do that, right? So you described this idea of someone, you come across him and he's going 3, 2, 1, phew, I finished or whatever. At what point does he have to say Aleph naught? When did that happen? That doesn't have to happen at any point. So that if you think it's different, if you think that there's something problematic about having to state the number that's not a successor of any number, that just doesn't feature in that story, right? So that can't be what's problematic about it. So generally, what's problematic about that is supposed to be, look, this is just a different argument to the traversing the actual influence, just flagging that. What's supposed to be problematic about that is it's just, well, look, why didn't he finish yesterday or tomorrow or whatever? What explains the guy finishing now? Because if he's had an infinite amount of time to get here, he should have had enough time already to finish yesterday or something, right? So then it's supposed to be a kind of challenge to the principle of sufficient reason. And it seems to me that the thing to say about that is, a very, very strong principle of sufficient reason, which is that everything has a sufficient reason, is problematic on its own anyway. And most theists these days don't endorse the really strong version of it, right? Because what they're going to say is something along the lines of, because if you say, well, why did God make this contingent universe instead of that one? Why didn't he make a universe where this atom was just very slightly to the left of where it happens to be right now? Why, how come, right? Because surely that can't then was justifying a moral principle that makes him have to do it this way rather than that way. And they'll say, yeah, sure, okay, so that what happened there is that God makes a free choice, and if you push exactly why that free choice was made rather than a different free choice, then there's no necessitating sufficient reason that you can give for that, right? So there's no contrastive reason, right? Reason that explains why he did A rather than B, right? What there is some non-contrastive reason, right? Something that played into the circumstances, right? There's some kind of adequate but less than sufficient reason or explanation of what happened there. And okay, if that's the game we're playing, then it's not unreasonable to apply the same thing to why the guy's counting down and finishing now rather than yesterday. Am I supposed to provide a necessitating sufficient reason for that, or can I provide a non-contrastive, non-necessitating, non-sufficient reason as well? And it seems if I can, it seems like the door is open for that type of move there. So I can just say something like, well, he chose to, right? It was just his intention to finish today. I don't know. Is that not possible? I don't know why that's not possible. Or to cook something else up, right? He has a kind of tendency to do that, and that's just the way he is, or something. I don't know. It just feels like if you can come up with well, God just chose to do this, then I can say something like that about what's happening here. So I'm not saying it's a completely watertight way of going about this, but what I'm just drawing attention to is that there's similarities in the way that what's supposed to be problematic about that counting down example isn't what Craig was saying about having to say Aleph naught at some point, because that doesn't happen in that scenario. And if it's something about being required by a strong principle of sufficient reason to explain why it was this moment and not some other moment, then that demand is too strong, right? Because theists wouldn't be able to live up to that demand themselves in other contexts, like why did God make this rather than that, and then apply the context, apply the standard that they use there, and it seems like it's not impossible to dream up some explanation that would give you a non-contrastive reason, because they're ten a penny, it seems to me. So it feels to me like that argument's like substantially weaker than the one we were dealing with in the paper. I think that's the weak one. So yeah,
a good way to go about it. I wonder if the theists could level some sort of principle along the lines of, it's just a defeasible principle that, all else being equal, we should prefer to minimize brute contrastive facts, right? And so if they do that, well then they could say like, okay, suppose that's possible, then someone could count down in such a manner, and that would sort of multiply brute contrastive facts, and hence all else being equal, we at least have the feasible evidence against an infinite path. So I wonder what you think of that.
I mean, I think when we're talking about evidence and that type of rule of thumb thing, then I think that there's something I think that there's something inappropriate about that here. I mean, what counts as evidence that he's really counting down from infinity? I mean, unless I've been watching him the whole time, I don't. It's not clear that it's a good way of approaching this, to think about it in terms of like evidence and defeasible rules and stuff. I mean, I have to just assume like an a priori thought experiment that is what he's doing. And now I'm in that world, I'm not sure defeasible rules is the right way to go. It feels like what we're doing is some a priori principle way of reasoning here. And I mean, and the way that the rubber meets the road here is that, like, well, I mean, if that just is what's happened, right? Like, if that's the premise of the thought experiment, then I mean, he has done, okay? So it has to be explained in some way. And the minimum, you can't just say, well, my preference is that weird things like that don't happen very much because I have a rule of thumb which tries to minimize that type of explanation I'd be forced to give there. Because, I mean, if it has happened, the minimum amount of explanation you'd need would be one that at least explains that, right? And if that happens twice, because some other guy finishes counting down tomorrow, I'm going to need to explain that too, right? That's the minimum a minimum required in that world, right? Because there's at least two events that are weird like that need explanation. And the principle has to just be explaining as few things as you can, whilst explaining as much as you can. Resorting to non-contrastive explanations as few times as you can, whilst accounting for all of the things that need accounting for in the world that you're in. And if we're just saying by stipulation that you're in a world where somebody actually does count down from infinity to zero, then the minimum that you can get away with is that. Like if God actually did make a free choice to create the world, then you're going to need to take that tool off the shelf anyway and apply it to that situation. Everything else being equal, I'd rather not take that thing off the shelf to have to use it here. But you know what I do, because God made a choice and I need to find some kind of explanation for it, right? So if there's an infinite barrage of people all counting down from infinity and all finishing at different times all over the place, damn it, it's going to be a really confusing world, and I'm going to have to keep reaching for non-contrastive explanations in order to like say stuff about what's going on. We don't live in that world, I'm pretty sure. It would be difficult to know even if we did, or if it just looked like we did. But that seems to me the actual empirical question of like what I would say if I was like face to face with that doesn't really seem relevant. The question is just like the a priori one has to be explain the stuff that in principle is put into play by the thought experiment that you happen to be playing about with. So yeah, that's how I would come back to that. It's just you'd need to say something about that if that's what actually happened.
Okay, we can go to Micah if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't really have anything on that. That all sounded good to me. I mean, move on to something else. But yeah, no, that all sounded fine to me. I don't know if you have anything more there, Joe, or else we needed to cover, but I'm good there.
Micah.
What's up?
I think we can go on to some of your questions.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, okay, sure thing. Well, I mean, my questions were more, I had some, like, mine were more about, like, the disanalogy. I keep, like, thinking of disanalogies between, like, Hilbert's Hotel and like, what the Quig's trying to draw with actual infinites. And one thing that's just weird to me, there's a couple things that are weird to me here, and if it's not relevant, we've covered it already. Oh, sorry, no. Actually, remember the one thing I want to cover first. We talked a little bit about, like, adding events to the past constantly, but it sounds kind of similar, but to another point you raise, I think the thought experiment Morrison gives was originally like recurring praises, like from two angels, but then like I think the version you guys use is the recurring curses from the demons. So we have contrasting angels, demons there. We switched it, so we'll stick with the demons one. Like
probably my bad influence on Wes there to make it more demonic than it had to be before.
Yeah, it went from two angels to one demon, from praises to curses. So I like it. Yeah, so I remember you kind of covered this a little bit with your relay theology episode, and it's a similar point to the one we talked about prior, but I think it's different, and it's interesting to talk about and important. Like, if we have this demon that's saying curses, like at each interval, it's like, well, it's true that he'll curse this person at like time t1, then time t2. Like for every curse he says, no matter like at whatever curse he says, there's always like an infinite amount of curses yet to be said. Like, so no matter how many he has said, say he said like 1,000,000 curses, like at time t 1,000,000, it's like, well, now he said 1,000,000 curses. There's still an infinite amount of curses left to be said. So you kind of draw at this point about how, more explicitly about how a potential infinite sequence of events, or a potential infinite of like recurring events kind of, not entails isn't the right word. I might not be phrasing it properly, but like there's kind of always this underlying actual infinite almost, or at least like in principle, that like no matter how many curses he said, or praises, we'll go with curses, or how many curses the demon said, there's an infinite amount of curses left to be said. So you raise this, of course, an objection to Craig of like saying, well, if there are potentially infinite amount of future events, then for every event we have, there's still like an actual infinite there. There's no, so that's kind of similar to the point, but I mean, the other point was about adding events to the past. This is about like going forwards, and like, there's always an actual infinity behind a potential infinity. So I thought that was really relevant if we want to talk about that a little bit.
Right. So I mean, this is a bit more controversial, and there are people who take a slightly different view to me on this. But another way, and this is an independent way of doing this, and you don't have to buy this next bunch of stuff I'm saying, right? But one way that appeals to some people is to think about this like this. So Cantor himself made this argument in a letter that he wrote to another mathematician in the 19th century, where he says, like, look, so he's talking about like variables, right? Like variables that can take numbers as their values. And he's saying, look, if we can have a variable where it can take any finite value, then we have to have a range of values that it can take, right? Like, so with contrasting the value with the range, right? So the range is just like the domain, the set of all of the possible values that it could take. And the idea is, well, if the value that the variable can take can be any finite value, then the range of values, all of those taken together, has to be infinite, right? So if I can increase the variable without limit, approaching infinity as a limit, right, and it always being finite. So basically, if it can have any finite number as its value, then it has to have a range which is actually infinite. So for there to be a potential infinite, there has to be a corresponding actual infinite. That's Cantor's argument. And it just seems to me that that's just true, right? It's just like a straightforward, back of the net, definitely true, obvious truism. But obviously, it doesn't happen in every case, right? There are cases where what you've got is something that looks a bit like the first case, that's potential infinite, that doesn't have the corresponding actual infinite underneath it, the range that's sitting underneath it. And those cases are interesting. It's interesting to see the differences between them, right? So so there's this conception of sets, right? There's the iterative hierarchy of sets, as things set theorists called Zermelo first came up with. It's basically a way of avoiding the paradoxes of set theory. So what you've got is a conception of sets, which forms a hierarchy, right? And at the bottom of the hierarchy, you've got the empty set, right? The set with no elements in it. And then the next level of the hierarchy, you've got the set that contains the empty set, right? And then there's different ways of doing it, but let's say the next level of the hierarchy contains the set that contains the set that contains the empty set, right? And it just like keeps piling them on, right? So, at no point do you need to have anything other than sets and the empty set. You don't actually have to have any elements if you don't want to. I mean, there's different ways of doing this, right? But this sort of simplest way of looking at it, you can just construct a new level. Right? The next level is always just the set that contains the previous level, right? And because that's just how it works at every single step. Each level contains the previous one, right? In fact, each level contains all of the previous ones, right? Because they all contain each other. So like Russian dolls or something. So yeah, okay, it's like Russian dolls where at every stage the outside Russian doll contains all of the inside ones, right? And then you might say, well, look, with my Russian dolls, at any point I keep like enclosing the previous ones inside a bigger one, right? There's always only finitely many Russian dolls, right? Only goes down so far. But let's try and think about how there could be an end point to this, right? Could the hierarchy have a like highest point to it or something? And you kind of see that there can't be a highest point here, right? Like, because, I mean, let's pick a level and pretend that was the highest point. Well, I could just think of the set that contained that level, right? And that would be the next level, right? So there's no way that you can have a level which is the final level, because like by definition, it can always be extended by just chucking that thing into a set, whatever that was. So what we've got here is a hierarchy, right, which sort of presents itself at the bottom. You can understand it, but you can't understand how it could have an end, right? So it just keeps going and going and going. And one way of looking at it is that it's not like totalizable. Right? You can't just put it into a totality in any way. You can't even think about a totality of it, because like any type of totality you think of, I can just say, think of the set that contains that thing, right? Like, and then you've like you've exceeded what your limits were. You've gone beyond that. So that's weird, right? And that's kind of different to time, though, right? Or numbers, right? Because I can say, you know, the totality of the natural numbers, right? But that's not another natural number, right? That's like a set of numbers. It's just a different type of thing, right? So the totality of natural numbers is totalizable, right? You can think of all of them together, because what it constitutes as a totality is something that's kind of conceptually different from each of the individual bits of it, right? But with the set hierarchy, if you try and like put it in a box, what you find is that the box you've put it in is of the same type as the elements itself. It's just a set of things. So that in that sense, that's why you can't capture it and like totalize it. I mean, another example of this would be all of the thinkable things, right? Like, I mean, try and think of all of the thinkable things, the set, like the totality of all of the thinkable things, right? Well, now you've just made a new one because you've just thought of that thing which you hadn't thought about before, and then now I've just done it again. Oh, whoops! And again, oh, whoops! I've just done it again. Like, you can't like contain that, right? Like, it sort of expands without your ability to control it, right? So there are some things like that have this weird, like always infinitely extendable property where you can't contain them. But numbers are not like that, because the totality of, say, natural numbers isn't a natural number, right? So it's like capturable under a concept. And then we think about it, well, is time like that? No, time is like a number, right? It's more like a number than a iterative set, because I mean the totality of times isn't a time, right? It's just like kind of, you just sort of like see it as like a line or whatever. It's just like the totality of it is of a different nature than each of the bits. So it's like numbers. I mean, numbers and time are very similar to each other, and they're not similar to iterative hierarchies. So anyway, the point with this digression is that with an iterative hierarchy, you can think of it as a potential infinite in the sense that in some way it's kind of always increasing, and it doesn't have like a top ceiling level to it. But it doesn't really fit that pattern of the Cantor's argument where it has to have a range that's actually infinite. There's no reason to think that there is a range or anything that compares to that, because, as I said, it can't be totalizable. So it seems to me, anyway, that while there are exceptions to that Cantor's argument, the one that he sketches out in his letter, numbers and time are not the exceptions to that. It does apply to them. Maybe it doesn't apply to things like iterative hierarchy of sets, and it doesn't apply to that like constructible set of thinkable things or whatever, right? There are things that are different to that, but it just seems to me that time and numbers are obviously not those things that stand an exception to it. So while I concede it's not a universal rule, it seems to me that it's a rule that has limited application, and some of the things that it applies to is both numbers and time. So I mean, that's how I see that. And that's not necessarily a view that Wes shares. I mean, I haven't really gone into that with him in so much detail, but it's not an argument that we use in the paper. And I know that there are philosophers who don't see it the same way as me, exactly the same way anyway. So Yeah, I don't rely on that necessarily too much, but I mean, I like that. I like it, so it's something I think about.
Yeah, actually, yet again, this is an instance of a symmetry breaker, right? Because you're given these sort of counterexamples, as it were, and they're like, well, and you want to apply it to time, and so you need to find some sort of relevant difference or symmetry breaker between applying it to time and these other cases. And what you're giving is the sort of totalizable symmetry breaker with respect to the domains in question. So I just think it's really interesting that yet again, here's another symmetry breaker and a relevant difference. So.
Yeah, and I think that there could be like sorry, so just what very quickly. I think that maybe somebody could launch a defense of time where it's similar to the iterative hierarchy, and maybe that's how Craig wants to say that this works, right? That time is like that, but I'd need to see the detail of that. I mean, it feels like it would be an interesting project if somebody wants to go away and do that, but it feels very much to me like. That would require a lot of work, sketching that out in detail. It would be cool to see it, but that's not typically how philosophers of time think about time. So it would be a new way of modeling it. It would be cool, actually. It's a really cool idea. Maybe someone can do that. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh, no problem. No, I was just saying, it was on my mind because I recently just like in prep for this re-listened to your episode with Real Atheology on this and talking about that, and I kind of shared your intuition about, I remember thinking like, yeah, that kind of seems right to me. Like if it is the case, like Craig believes, and I think it's especially relevant on presentism for him to say that like it's always true that there will be infinitely more events in temporal succession. Like it's always, no matter where we stop, it is always the case that there will be infinitely many more events. So like specifically his philosophy of time combined with this just like sort of principle he has to adopt with his presumably with his soteriology and eschatology, that like it is the case that there will not be like a stopping point, because obviously that would be different. Like if there's a stopping point, then yeah, we're done. But like since he presumably doesn't think that, and he thinks every event's gonna have temporal succession, it's like, yeah, there's always going to be infinitely many more. So how is he going to get around that? So that was just something that was on my mind and really interesting to me. Did you have anything else on that, Joe, on that like whole point? Because that was a interesting thing for me. Or you?
I think we're good. I think we're good to move on to another point.
Okay. Did you have? I mean, that was one of mine. Did you have another question you wanted to cover?
Let's see.
Joe's like, I have 7. How much time do you have? Yeah.
So, I mean, perhaps we can, instead of asking a different question, we can that was funny. You guys just did the same thing that Phaser and Oppie did. You guys took a drink of the screenshot that. I put on Facebook. Let's see. So instead of asking another question, I'm thinking about, well, technically it's a question, but giving the audience just a glimpse into some of the ways that Craig's responses don't truly constitute symmetry breakers. So, I mean, perhaps we can talk about, well, maybe I can leave it up to Alex if he wants to go do the future events as pure potentialities one, by appealing to the act potency distinction for a symmetry breaker, or perhaps we can do a different one that that Alex would want to cover, like, yeah, so maybe we could do that for the listeners to gain a better sense of the paper itself.
Yeah, okay. So sometimes Craig says, well, it's not true that there's an infinite number of, say, days that will happen, right? That actually there's 0 like future times, right? Because the future doesn't exist, right? Like only the present exists. So the number of future days isn't Aleph naught, it's 0. And so there's like a basic 2 kind of quick responses here. Like one of them is to say, well, on presentism, right, that's also true for the past as well, right? Like, I mean, if only the present exists, then no past events exist. And if no past events exist, then, it's not true that infinitely many do. And if infinitely many don't, then it's not Hilbert's Hotel, right? So it can't be, that's obviously, presentism is just obviously symmetrical in terms of the past and the future. What it says of the past, it says of the future in terms of ontology, in terms of claiming which of those categories exist. They're both equally non-existent. So it's no help to just say, well, the future doesn't exist because presentism, That's not a symmetry breaker. Another way to put this is he say something like, and I mean, well, so sticking on presentism for just a second. I mean, even then, let's just be clear about it. Presentist still thinks. So, I mean, we can distinguish between presentists who think that there will be more times to come, and presentists who think that the end is literally nigh, like right now, right? Like that guy thinks that there's no future events because he's like, this is it right now, right? There won't be any future events. But unless you're that type of apocalyptic presentist, you think that even though there are no future events, there will be, right? And then you just go, well, how many will there be? And if there's no end to the future, then the answer has to be again an actual infinite number, right? Because I could number them, and there would be just as many as there are natural numbers, and could line it up with proper subsets of itself, and blah blah blah. So we're back in square one again. So just simply appealing to the non-existence of future events isn't relevant here, right? Because what we're asking is not how many future events exist right now; it's how many future events will exist, right? And then once we put it into once the tenses are clear, it seems to me that that doesn't help. So another way that Craig tries to go here is to say, look, there's an asymmetry with respect to the past and the future, and it's that the past is actual, right? Whereas the future is potential. And I'm not sure that I buy that distinction necessarily. Anyway, I mean, well, one way of looking at it is that really is just an epistemic distinction, right? Like I just don't know the future in this as well as I know the past, right? Like it just feels to be there's a kind of causal access to the world that I have, which is asymmetric, and that just makes me think that ontologically there's also a difference there. But maybe that's just misleading, right? And maybe the future exists just as much as the past. So I'm not convinced that that's true, but let's just say it was true, right? Let's just pretend that the future is like potentials and that the past and present are actual or something. So this is like an Aristotelian idea or like a growing block idea or something like that. Well, I mean, on that view, let's just adopt that let's put that metaphysical hat on for a minute and just say that that's true, right? So in that case, there is an asymmetry. Is that game over for my argument? And I think the answer is still no, it's not, because, I mean, we're not saying there's no asymmetry. What we're saying is that there's no symmetry breaker, right? And so the point is that it doesn't make any relevant difference, right? Because, okay, let's say that the future is all potentialities. Well, we can just say how many future potentialities will become actual, right? We just sort of like say the question that we just said a minute ago, but like dress it up in the verbiage of the Aristotelian way of looking at things, right? How many potentialities will become actualized or something? It's the same question, right? And the answer is still going to be the same, right? It's going to be like the cardinality of all of the future potentialities that will become actualized is has Cantor's property, right? It's going to be an actual infinite. So it doesn't really make any difference, right? You can, and here's, it seems to with some sort of suspicion, is that people think that an actual infinite, because it's got the word actual in, can't be made up of things which are potentials in that kind of Aristotelian sense. But that's a misunderstanding. It's a kind of terminological misunderstanding, right? An actual infinite just means it has Cantor's property, right? Where the cardinality is such that you can line up proper parts with the whole. And potentialities is something that comes from Aristotelian language, and they're things that can be enumerated in principle. Like there could be maybe 10 potentialities will become actualized. I mean, let's say there's 10 future presidents of America before it like collapses under its own anti-democratic catastrophe or whatever, right? Let's say something like that happens. But because we're Aristotelians, we've got Aristotelian hat on, we have to regard those as like potential future presidents, or the acts of inaugurating those are mere potentialities or something. Doesn't mean we can't enumerate them, right? Like how many are there? There's 10. So I mean, as long as you can count them, it doesn't really matter what their ontological status is, right? Whether they're future tense statements, potentialities, it doesn't really make any difference. The point is just if there's an actual infinite number of them, that's supposed to be enough to cause the problems that we looked at with Hilbert's Hotel, That's what Craig is saying. It's just anything, as long as you can remember. He's saying as long as you can mentally add and subtract from them. Right? They don't even need to manifest these properties in any kind of realistic causal structure. As long as you can mentally add and subtract them, that's enough. Well, I can mentally add and subtract pure potentialities that will become actualized over time. Right. So if that's good for the goose, it's good for the gander again. Right. So there's just, yeah, that you can play around with these ontological pictures if you like, but like, does it make a relevant symmetry breaker? And the answer is just like, no, obviously no, right? Like it definitely doesn't help in this context. It's just kind of what we're doing is just changing vocabulary. We're just stating the same thing in under a different guise, right? And that's not helpful. That's not progress. That's just kind of distraction or something. So
Yeah.
that's one of those areas. It just seems black and white to me.
Yeah. One thing I thought about reading this and reading some of your comments on Craig presentism was just like, I'm just kind of curious, like if we're again with the Aristotelian hats on, we're presentists, like it seems to me sometimes almost like past events will have to be like in their own category, separate from active, because like they're not potentialities. It's not the case that they potentially exist, but it's also on presentism not the case they actually exist. You know, there are things being actualized. So there's like this potential existence, there's actual existence. On the Aristotelian framework, it's like, well, there's the stuff that actually exists in the present, well, Aristotelianism and presentism combined. There's the stuff that actually exists in the present, there's the stuff that will exist in the future. And I'm kind of with Graham Oppie, and he mentioned this in one of our discussions. I'm with him, and I don't think there are any non-existent things. I don't think there are things that don't exist. I think we can, like, for presentists, we can talk about potentialities, but it's not as if they're actually have their own like ontological existence yet. Same thing about past events, though. But I kind of wonder, this might be a sidetrack, but I do wonder like what past events are. And I know, Joe, you're much more familiar with the metaphysics than I am. So I don't know if you guys want to talk about this at all. It's just interesting to me. I'm curious on like an Aristotelian presentist, like what are past events on Craig's view if he's going to take this Aristotelian account of change? Like they're not actual, only the present's actual, and it's constantly in the state of becoming the past, which is no longer actual. Like you can't have potentialities backwards in time. We can't manipulate that. So it's not like we can have potential changes. I don't know. That may not be relevant. It was just interesting to me. But I don't know. What do you guys think? That just seems weird. And because I think I was doing the same thing when I first read your paper and first heard this. I was conflating like actual, because I was thinking like actual in the Aristotelian sense, and then it'd be like actual infinity. And my first intuition was like, well, Craig's not talking about an actual infinity in the past because it doesn't exist. None of that stuff exists on his view. But of course, that's not the mathematical. I mean, again, they can still have the Cantorian property. So it's kind of, that was my original intuition. And I was like, oh, wait, that's not what's being meant there. But it still was like an interesting distinction for me. But I don't know what you guys think of any of that or if it's even relevant.
Well, I mean, human imagination is boundless, right? So that you could probably come up with fun combinatorial views of like different bits of positions from different places, and like I could like be a kind of presentist, but think about, I don't know. So one way to think about it was you might say there are like modal facts or something about like so I might say, look, it's really true now that the coin, it's possible that the coin will land heads and it's possible that the coin will land tails, right? But that type of openness, right, contingency about what way round things could be changes as time passes, right? So like in the past, coin flippings are always like either heads or tails, and there's no like in between this sort of contingency about them, and that's the sense in which the past events are actual, right? Even though they don't exist, they have like a different modal like profile or something. I mean, you could cash it out like that, or you could do something else. I mean, it's up to you, right? Like I said, human imagination is kind of limitless, so you could cook up something like that. So I'm not saying that like, the presentism is stupid or that there's doesn't make sense or it's incoherent or whatever. I mean, I'm not saying that, right? That's not required for this argument to go through. It doesn't make any difference. All that's required is that you can enumerate the things, whether you classify them as actual, whether you classify them as like currently existing, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't really make any difference. If you can enumerate them, then it's game on, right? Because that's because Craig's bar is so low, all you need to be able to do is imagine them being different. And then, it's game on, right? If I can imagine pure potentialities that will become actual at some point being different, right? And it feels like I can. So, yeah, I mean, there's loads of different ways you could combine those things. I think just for the purposes of this argument, which are quite narrow, it doesn't really matter. There,
Yeah.
You take your pick, right? Build your metaphysical picture how you like, but just try and explain to me how it makes a relevant symmetry difference here. That's the game that we're playing.
Right.
Yeah.
So I also think that while this is like a really important thing for presentists and Aristotelians, or I guess I should say an Aristotelian presentist should keep in mind, I agree with Alex that, it's really the fact that we can enumerate them. That's what's really spawning these symmetry worries. But just to so I agree that the problem's still going to be there for the Kalam, at least for Craig's version of the Kalam. To touch on this a bit.
Whoa.
Yeah, Joe,
your voice is getting super weird.
Yeah. Audio got warbled there.
Try saying something.
There's a clap.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. You're good now.
Okay.
Super robot.
Where did I cut out?
You were starting to talk about, it was towards the beginning.
You were saying as long as you can enumerate them.
Yeah, you were just pass it.
So I do think that the symmetry problem for the Kalam is still going to be there, right? Because we can enumerate them. But I also think that this is an important thing that the Aristotelian presentist needs to grapple with. So what I would say is that most Aristotelian presentists are going to take either a sort of causal or branching or temporal view of modality. Okay, so they're going to say okay, in a timeless sense, dinosaurs are possible. And in that sense, they're potential, as it were, in that they're timelessly potentially existent, and that potential can be actualized by an evolutionary process. So we can speak of it from a timeless perspective. But there's also a modality that's almost temporally indexed. So indexed from the now, yesterday is impossible, or not potential, I guess I should say. It's obviously possible because it did happen, but it's not even potentially existent. Because clearly it's not actual, and potential is almost future directed or causally future directed. So under their understanding of temporal modality, it's not even potentially existent. We can't change it. There's a sense in which it's necessary, but from a timeless sense, it's not necessary. It's contingent. Yesterday could have gone differently. So Alex was going, I was actually going to say that as well. Just we have to bring in the modal considerations and distinguish between the timeless potentials versus the temporally indexed potentials.
Yeah, but even when you do that, it seems like nice distinction, like the picture. How does it break the symmetry? Answer: it doesn't, right? So it's
I think your point still goes through because it's still enumerable.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I mean, I guess maybe there's a way out of this where you say, well, there are no truths about the future, right? Maybe you could be sort of open theists, say that there's no truths about the contingent future, right? So if I say, which way will the coin land? They just say it's false that it'll land heads and it's false that it'll land tails, right? It's just there's just no truth about which way it's going to land. And that means that's why God doesn't know which way it's going to land. And that helps because it means that it helps with all sorts of things like problem of evil or whatever. It's like God's doing his best because he doesn't know what the consequences of things are going to be, blah, 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 right? So it sort of solves that, that kind of tradition of God knew and he was all powerful and he wanted to do something and why didn't he do it? And we're basically saying, well, he doesn't know, so that's why. Anyway, if you have a view like that, right, or just not for theological reasons, you could have in the literature on this type of stuff is kind of associated with Charles Sanders Peirce. So it's Peirceanism would be that view that there's future contingents are false. I guess if you have that kind of view, then it's false that there will be that Gabriel will make a praise tomorrow, or that the demon will say a curse tomorrow. It's false that he will. Right? I mean, if it's contingent, let's say maybe he'll say a curse tomorrow. It's a potential or something. I mean, they might just say, well, look, I just think all of those sentences are false, right? So I'm kind of take a radical view like that. But sentences about the past don't have that. Then maybe they're true or false, right? They're bivalent. I mean, maybe you could do something like that, right? I mean, okay. I mean, I'm not saying there's absolutely no way out of this, but like, what is that a view that Craig has? No, it's not Craig's view. Craig thinks that God knows the future, and he knows the contingent future in particular, because he's a Molinist, right? Molinists think that there's a single course of future contingent history, and God knows it in advance. So, like, yeah, that somebody could have that. They could have that kind of view. It might be a bit of a weird view, like we're talking about before with the conceptions of the afterlife or whatever. Somebody could have that view. It might be a bit weird. Somebody could have it. Does Craig have it? No, Craig doesn't have that view. So, like, he's still in trouble, even if somebody can jump out of the frying pan and make it to safety. I don't think Craig's going to be able to do that here. So we are pinning Craig. I mean, it's a kind of trollish argument in a way, because I'm like sort of picking on someone in particular. I'm being like, you can't get out of this.
It's also what I'm doing with Head Phaser. Like in a lot of the papers that I've recently written, I feel bad because it's like trolling. It's like all of them are directed at Phaser. It's like so funny.
Yeah, but I mean, it's also like that's what philosophy is. It's just a series of like one person pointing out the previous guy was wrong about something. It's just like 2,000 years of that happening. So I mean, it's within the tradition that's what happens. And yeah, I mean, really like insignificant and uninteresting people are not the people you pick on to like say why they're wrong for a career or whatever.
It's a compliment. Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of is. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so we just ran over then the ideas of, well, can you appeal to future events not existing, or can you appeal to future events being potentialities, right? And it feels just like very straightforward in those cases that you can't. There's one additional type of puzzle, which I guess maybe we'll move on to. I mean, unless you wanted to say any further things about that. There's one additional type of puzzle, which is kind of different to those, which I don't know if Craig really makes explicitly himself, right? But it's a puzzle that's put forward by a kind of Craigian philosopher, this guy Andrew Loke, right? Who makes that in his book on the Kalam. And actually, this argument is also made by the philosopher Benedetti, who has this great book on infinity, which you guys should grab a copy of if you don't have that already, because it's a really fun. It's nuts. This guy's like really hilarious writer, and goes into these like mind-bending infinity kind of paradoxes and stuff. So Grim Reaper paradox comes from that book. There's loads of paradoxes. The Thompson's lamp one, I think, comes from there, if not somewhere else. But he like popularizes a bunch of these paradoxes, and it's really cool thinking about them, even though actually he's a defender of the actual infinite, right? Like he thinks that the actual infinites can be instantiated in the world. Anyway, so this paradox goes a bit like this, right? Like it's supposed to be a way of sidestepping the discussions about the ontology of time, right? Like, so we're not talking about, well, what if the future events were like non-existent or pure potentialities or something. It's trying to get out of that and say, find an argument that works, even if like the B theory was true or something, right? Like this, so this is supposed to be a different way of finding a symmetry breaker, and it works by the following. So it's, instead of saying that the past or indeed the future would be an actual infinite themselves, right? What we're saying is that that they might give rise to something existing in the present which was actually infinite, like Hilbert's Hotel, right? Something whose infinite extent is all together at the same time, right? Because the infinite extent of the past is just like one thing after another, each of which is finite at any one time. It's only taken collectively that you think of it as an actual infinite. Whereas Hilbert's Hotel is all of it together, that's like right now, here, there's a thing that's infinite in extent. So the idea would be, if like that's the thing that would happen, which would be bad if the past was infinite, there could be something like that existing right now. And they're saying, well, there could be something like that existing right now if the past was infinite, but that doesn't happen if the future is infinite, right? The infinity of the future doesn't allow that there could be something existing altogether right now which is infinite in the same way. So And here's how that entailment's supposed to work, right? It's like, if the past was infinite, then God could have made, on each previous day, he could have made a hotel room, right? And added it to this like hotel, basically, one hotel room after another, making it bigger and bigger and bigger. And so each day, all he's doing is making a hotel room, and that seems like perfectly reasonable that he could do that. But what would happen is that if he'd been doing it for an infinite amount of time, then today there would be one hotel room for each previous hotel room building event, right? Which would mean that there'd be an infinite number of hotel rooms. So it would be a Hilbert's hotel, right? So if we think that Hilbert's hotels can't exist, then that would show you that there couldn't be a past infinite amount of time. Because if the past was infinite, then that scenario could happen where he's building one room every day. And if that happened, a Hilbert's hotel would exist in the present, right? So that's the argument. You can't, if a Hilbert's hotel couldn't exist now, then that infinite series of hotel room building events couldn't happen either. But if the past was infinite, then that sequence of infinite room building events could happen. Therefore, the past must be finite, it couldn't be infinite. But then take a infinite future, right? Well, if God, I don't know, started making and made one hotel room now, and then he made another one tomorrow, and then another one after that, right? There'd never be an Hilbert's hotel. There'd only ever be a finite hotel and many rooms, right? It would always be bigger as time was going, but it would never become an actually infinite hotel. It'd be like a potentially infinite Hilbert's hotel or something. So that way, in that way, the infinite past has this entailment that the infinite future doesn't. It makes a Hilbert's hotel possible in the present, right? But Hilbert's hotel is impossible in the present. So there we go. So that's Locke's argument for why the past has to be finite, right? And that doesn't rely on the A theory of time or presentism or anything like that. Right? It just seems to rely on the possibility of previous past days of God making a hotel each day of God making a single individual hotel room. Okay, so does that make sense so far as the setup for this different type of symmetry breaker?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, do we have any questions at this point before I go into why I think that's wrong?
I mean, the only thing I thought so far was like his reasoning that God couldn't create an infinite, like if he started now. It sounded kind of like the you can't count to infinity objection. It sort of sounded similar, like there may be a similar way out of that. But that was the only thing I thought so far, but everything else was clear, so that was it so far. You have anything, Joe?
Well, just before, so the difference, so with the counting to infinity thing, right? What's going on here is that we're sort of saying a future perfect thing. Like, will it have been that God has made a Hilbert's hotel? Like, because what you're looking at is like looking back on what he's done right now. Does this thing that currently exists constitute a Hilbert's hotel? And the answer is going to be no. Every day he adds another room. If he starts now, then every future day he's going to be adding a room, and he's never going to have something that's not just a finite hotel. But of course, you could ask, well, how many rooms will he add? And the answer will be he will add infinitely many rooms. It's just that there's no point at which there are infinitely many rooms currently in existence if he starts now and just keeps going forever. Right. So that's the difference. So the will count to infinity is quite compatible with never having had counted to infinity, right? So it's a reasonably subtle point, but like, I mean, the Dretski's idea was if George starts counting now, he will count infinitely many numbers, but it will never be that he has counted infinitely many numbers, right? So it's future tense, actually infinite, but future perfect, always finite, potential, growing, but never getting to infinity thing. So it's exactly that distinction I was making before about how on Craig's view, it's actually the past that's a potential infinite, and the future is always an actual infinite, right? So we're back to exactly the same territory. It's just an unfamiliar new guise of the same idea. As I said before, what we're doing often here is changing vocabularies to describe the same structure, the same concepts underneath it. So it can be difficult and bewildering to get your head around. But yeah, it's all good. It's the same concept from before. Anyway, so so what's going on here? I think the fun way to think about this is to think about God's omnipotence, right? Like, if the idea is a Hilbert's hotel is impossible, right, then anything which entails a Hilbert's hotel is also impossible. That's how this argument's running. So if a Hilbert's hotel is impossible and an infinite future entails a Hilbert's hotel, then an infinite past entails a Hilbert's hotel, then an infinite past is impossible. But we might think, well, look, if God can do absolutely anything, then he could kind of just click his fingers and make a Hilbert's hotel pop into existence. Like, why not, right? If he's omnipotent, that seems like something he could do. But if that's right, then we run the same argument again, and we could say, well, if a Hilbert's hotel is impossible, and anything that entails a Hilbert's hotel is impossible, and God entails the possibility of a Hilbert's hotel, then God's impossible, right? So that can't do for a theist, right? So what they're going to say is, naturally, not that God can't do absolutely anything, right? Like, that's kind of like a schoolboy, like, rookie mistake to think about absolutely anything, because that means he could make a rock so big that he couldn't lift it, blah, 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 right? So what they're going to say is something like, well, that God's omnipotence has some kind of, like, restrictions to it. For instance, he can't do anything logically impossible, right? But also you might think, well, God can't do anything metaphysically impossible either. Like, what God's omnipotence means is that he can do everything metaphysically possible, but he can't do anything metaphysically impossible, right? So that's the range of his abilities, sort of encompasses in completely the metaphysical possibilities. And if we're saying that a Hilbert's hotel is impossible, metaphysically impossible, then that's why God can't just make one come into existence. So it's like if he said, let there be a Hilbert's hotel, like, nothing would happen. It would just fail to have any effect, right? Because that's like beyond his abilities to do that. It's like if he said, let there be a triangle with 4 sides on it, right? Nothing would happen. So in order to get around this objection that, like, if a Hilbert's hotel is impossible, then God would be impossible, you have to restrict God's omnipotence down to something like metaphysical possibility is the limit of what he can do. But then if we do that, it starts to seem like, well, so what we're doing in particular is that we're saying, well, look, God could make a hotel of any finite size, right? Any n. He could make a hotel with n many rooms in it, right? For any finite n. But he couldn't make a hotel that had one room for each n, for every n, right? So there's like a scope distinction here. Like, it's for any n, it's possible that God makes n many hotel rooms, but it's not possible that God makes n many that God makes every n hotel rooms, right? He can't make a hotel so big that each room has a hotel has a number corresponding to each and every natural number, because that would mean he'd made a Hilbert's hotel, and that's impossible. But it's not like he can only make 100 rooms or something. He could make 101 rooms, and if he can make 101 rooms, he could make 102 rooms, and blah blah blah. So there's no finite limit on how many he could make, but there is a kind of infinite limit. He couldn't make infinitely many. So once we've got that, like, distinction clear, then it just seems like it applies in the case of the past, right? Like, you could say, well, God's restricted omnipotence allows him to make to spend n many past days making hotel rooms for any n, but not for every n, right? He couldn't spend absolutely every day making hotel rooms, right? There's no finite limit on how many days he could spend making hotel rooms, but it can't be that he spends all of them making hotel rooms, right? And that is the restriction we just introduced, right? That it's like for any n, he could make n many hotel rooms, but it couldn't be that he does it for every n, right? Any is possible, but not every. And if we just run that same distinction back into how many days could he spend making hotel rooms, we just simply could do any n number of days making hotel rooms, but not every n number of days making hotel rooms, right? And if that's the distinction, then it just solves the problem right there. But that distinction, I mean, I spoke to Loke about this. We had a very long email exchange about this. And he was saying, well, look, that won't do, right? Because the restriction on God's omnipotence is like what he can do all at once, right? Like the metaphysical impossibility of a Hilbert's hotel sort of is what prevents him, like a force or something, that it means that he can't move beyond it in the present. He just cannot do that, right? But at each day in the past, all that God is doing is making another hotel room. So he's just saying, let there be one more hotel room, And it feels like each of those individual events are things that were within his power to do, right? So you can't say, so there's no point at which he's doing something that exceeds that restriction on his power, right? If you split up all of the events diachronically, then at no point does it exceed that restriction. It exceeds its restriction only if you like make all of them into one moment and say like, now make a Hilbert's Hotel all in one go, right? That's what's wrong. So and I mean, and the other way that he put it was like, well, that it can't be that like the impossibility of Hilbert's Hotel existing now affects him in the past and sort of prevents him at some point in the past from adding another hotel room, right? Like, because causation doesn't go backwards in time like that. He can't be affected yesterday by what's present today, right? So just because there's a Hilbert's Hotel today, that can't be why he stopped making hotel rooms yesterday or something, right? So there can't be this sort of spooky backwards in time causation, and the effect is spread out over time. So that doesn't seem to be such an issue, right? So the response to this is to say, well, look, on the one hand, let's just turn the temporal, so we spread out the Hilbert's Hotel building across an infinite sequence of days, each of which he only makes some finite number of rooms. But let's just, so that's a temporally extended Hilbert's Hotel construction. But we could spatially extend it too, right? So imagine that there's an avenue, infinite avenue, right? And at the address 1 infinite avenue, he could make a hotel, and he could also make a hotel at 2 infinite avenue as well. And he could also make a hotel at 3 infinite avenue as well, right? Or 4 as well. And you think, well, infinite avenue could be populated with hotels up to n infinite avenue, right? God could fill them with hotels up to that point. And there's no address at infinite avenue such that if God said, let there be a hotels up to that point, that he would fail, that his decree would fail. Yet on the restriction to God's omnipotence, he couldn't fill entirely infinite avenue with hotels, right? Because that would make it a Hilbert's Hotel. And then the question is just, well, if it makes sense there, right, that God can make hotel rooms up to n many hotels, up to n infinite avenue, but not fill them, why doesn't it make sense to say the same thing of the time case, that he could spend n many days making hotel rooms, but not all of them? And it seems to me that the spatial and the temporal case there are entirely analogous to one another. And so if you want to say that they're different, I need a even more symmetry. I need a symmetry breaker between the temporal case and the spatial case before I'm going to start to see that this itself could be a symmetry breaker between the past and the future, which the whole point of this argument is it's supposed to be a symmetry breaker, but it seems like it itself needs a symmetry breaker in order for it to get off the ground, right? So there's that argument, but then I think the even more crushing argument, which was to say, look, if there's a Hilbert's Hotel at T0, right, and all God has done previously is add finitely many hotel rooms to it, and what's happened is that's produced a Hilbert's Hotel at T0. Well, think about what the hotel looked like at T-1, right, like yesterday. It could only have finitely fewer rooms than it does today, right? But if you have infinite minus any finite number, right, like 3 or like 17 or whatever, it's still gonna like take that out of the set and then think to yourself, how many things have I got left in this set? Well, it's got Cantor's property, right? So it's still actually got the same number of things left. You could line each of the things up with the natural numbers. You're always going to be able to do that, no matter which n you remove from it, right? Like I said, to any n that you remove from an infinite set, it's going to still have the same number of things left in it. So actually what that shows you is that yes, if there's a Hilbert's Hotel today and all God is doing is adding finite rooms to it, then there was a Hilbert's Hotel yesterday and the day before, right? And actually there must have always been a Hilbert's Hotel at every point in the past. And so the idea that what you needed to have was some spooky backwards in time thing about like, well, it couldn't be the presence of Hilbert's Hotel today that was stopping God add a room to it yesterday. you don't actually need to appeal to anything going backwards in time. It's just that actually yesterday, what we were supposed to imagine was God adding a room to Hilbert's Hotel already there. But if Hilbert's Hotel is impossible, then God adding a room to Hilbert's Hotel is also an impossible scenario, right? Like, if P is impossible, then P and Q is impossible, right? That's like a basic kind of modal logic. Impossibilities like infect conjuncts or whatever, right? So it's not actually a possible scenario. So this whole thing was premised on the idea, well, if the past was infinite, then it's possible that God could have spent the whole time adding hotel rooms together. I mean, he kind of could, but if what's happened is that there's an infinite hotel today, then actually you've not described a possible world. You've described a world where there's a Hilbert's Hotel room everywhere. And if that's impossible, then you've described an impossible world. You haven't actually described a possible world. So it looks like a thought experiment that describes a possible world, but it only does that if you forget that Hilbert's hotels are impossible and then remember it later on in the argument. I mean, if you actually just keep it present to your mind the whole time through, you think, well, actually, no, this isn't even a possible world, right? This is just make-believing about something that's impossible. So it seems to me that just utterly destroys the argument completely. I mean, like, you have to have the restriction on God's omnipotence there, but once you do, then it just ruins the thought experiment, and it's game over for that, it seems to me.
Yeah, the last objection really, it sounds like it does kind of like it plays against that possibility premise of like entailing impossible, right? Like possibly entailing possible things, like potentially impossible. That's interesting. Yeah, I know. I'd like more. I'd have to look at more extrapolation of Locke's point. I know you guys had a discussion on this, but like, again, what exactly it is about the Hilbert's Hotel in the case of God creating it that like makes it impossible for God to create metaphysically? It's like, well, he's in one day. I mean, they obviously think he can create things ex nihilo if you're a classical theist, so that's not problematic. He can create physical things, and presumably he can create an infinite amount of things. But then they think like somehow a combination of some of those like properties then becomes like impossible. So it's really interesting. It's like, well, what's the problem with God creating a hotel room? It's like nothing. What about, what's the problem with God creating ex nihilo? Nothing. What's the problem with God creating an infinite set? Nothing. It's like, well, then what's the problem with him creating? So that last objection does seem really good. It's like, at what point does this thing gain a new property of like impossibility when all that you're putting into it? I mean, maybe I'm committing a composition fallacy here. Like, well, if God can do all this, surely he can do the thing that they all compose. I mean, maybe that's wrong, but still, it's just weird to me. I'm like, at what point do you cut this off and be like, okay, no, now that's where we say God can't do it? That seems like sort of arbitrary without further extrapolation. But yeah, I think that last point is really good. It's like, yeah, it's always going to be the case that there's a Hilbert's Hotel if you think God can. So yeah, that whole possibility premise there kind of doesn't exactly end up working out. So that's really interesting. I remember that was that around section 7 of your paper or 8. I think that was the one you said that was kind of like tacked on, but you found interesting.
Yeah, that's the final argument that we ran through. So it's not really Craig's argument there. It's Locke's argument, I guess. Right. But that's what seems to. And so we had a review of the paper suggested this idea where it was like it's kind of a reductio of Locke's argument again, but from a different angle, right? But so I mean, you might say the way Locke's argument is supposed to work is that you say if the past was possible, then a Hilbert's Hotel would be possible, right? Because for each day God could be making hotel rooms, but a Hilbert's Hotel is impossible, therefore the infinite past is impossible. It's going to modus ponens. But you could just like symmetrically flip that round and say, if the infinite future were possible, then God could spend each day destroying hotel rooms, right? Each day destroys one hotel room. But if he could always be destroying hotel rooms and never run out of hotel rooms to destroy, then it must be that there's a Hilbert's Hotel in the present. Because that's it. I mean, he destroys them, but he doesn't build any new ones.
Has to be there if he's going to destroy it. Yeah.
Yeah. He has to have an infinite stock of hotel rooms to constantly be ripping down more floors of Hilbert's Hotel. It has to be infinitely big for him never to like get to the bottom and have finished the job, right? If he could spend an infinite future just destroying hotel rooms and only do infinite ones any day and never run out, then that entails that there's a Hilbert's Hotel in the present, right? But there's something sort of more obviously wrong with that argument. Well, at least it's more obvious where the sort of Craigian or Lockean person is going to try and resist that is that they're going to say something like, well, hold on a minute. God isn't going to be able to spend an infinite amount of time destroying hotel rooms, because that obviously requires that there's already infinitely many things, like the resources must be infinite in the present already. So I'll just deny that he can spend every day in the future destroying hotel rooms. But then, this is the same thing. I mean, it just feels like that's all we're saying is, in the first place, he could spend n many days destroying hotel rooms, because that wouldn't entail anything about there being Hilbert's Hotel, right? And there's no limit. There's no finite amount of hotel rooms, which would be the most he could spend destroying as such, right? There's no real limit to that. But also, of course, it couldn't be that he spends every day destroying hotel rooms, just because that entails a Hilbert's Hotel. In fact, exactly the same way, it entails that there's always a Hilbert's Hotel, right? Because no matter how many floors you destroy of Hilbert's Hotel, if you only destroy finitely many, there's still infinitely many left, right? It doesn't matter how long you spend doing that for, right? So in exactly the same, it's exactly symmetrical that that if God's destructive powers are only finite as well, that he can't actually destroy a Hilbert's Hotel. He can't do anything to it. He can barely dent it, right? It's going to be basically of the same extent that it was in the first place. So there'll always be a Hilbert's Hotel in the future as well, right? So, I mean, the whole thing is just like completely symmetrical, and like there's no reason to accept either one of those arguments more than the other. They're both the same argument. They're just like one's in the future tense and one's in the past tense, and one says creation ex nihilo and the other one just says destroying to nothing, right? Like they're the exact opposite concepts to one another. But other than that, they're the same. So it just feels. I mean, what's fun about that example is that, like, it just seems to me, and this is a guess, I suppose, that a theist who defends the first argument would be more likely to object to the second one. It just seems more obvious that God couldn't just spend forever destroying stuff that he didn't create unless there was already an infinite amount of stuff there, and they're going to just say that. But it's actually the same argument. It's saying, well, he couldn't spend forever making stuff then in that case, right? Like, it's the same thing. Yeah, it's fun when you just like get into symmetry like things, sort of like twigs, and you realize how they're basically the same argument.
It is really interesting. One thing that's like the underlying principle there that's interesting too is, like, Locke, or whenever you're talking about like God spending days creating or destroying, there's kind of also a weird thing there for me. I don't know, in terms of like God and temporal succession. Like, maybe he could, why couldn't he create an infinite hotel, like, just in one moment? I think you guys covered this in your paper too, or destroy one in one moment. Like, and then even the idea of God spending days, it's not like he's, unless you think God's temporal, like Ryan Mullins or something, but generally the classical theist view, or the theist view, is that like God can't like spend a day, he can't be. So there's kind of an interesting we don't have time to go into like temporality of God and everything, but that's just another interesting point there of like, well, God's not going to spend a day creating anything. It was not going to take him a day. He could, again, and you guys raised this in your paper too, at the last section, you say, well, he could just, you said earlier, he could just say, let there be a Hilbert's Hotel. Like, he doesn't have to spend this finite amount of time doing anything. I guess he could, but doesn't have to. So there's a principle there. And yeah, the other thing to me there's just this interesting kind of underlying point with all this, with the Hilbert's Hotel examples, and then with like Craig's arguments, and like when they combine, I don't know if it's a disanalogy or not. I just think there's an interesting difference between like an infinite of objects and like an infinite of events. Like if we have like a set of infinite objects, that seems to me relevantly different from like an infinite set of like events or numerical, like denumerable succession of time. So I don't know if that like helps or hurts any of the arguments. It's just like another interesting distinction. But well, okay, so elephant in the room, or more so the Joe not in the room. We lost Joe a little while back, and he messaged me his Skype's not working, so we gotta finish without him. But he said thanks for like wonderful discussion and everything. So I want to be respectful of your time here and everything, like the 2-hour mark. So
yeah, I should probably go in a moment.
Yeah. So we can wrap up here. So yeah, that's kind of. Well, for one thing, I want to say thank you so much for coming on. This was like really stimulating, really fun.
Cool.
Always good to have discussion. So so thank you for coming on and the great discussions. Is there anything you want any closing remarks or anything else you'd want to say? Go ahead, or if we're good, we can.
I think we're good. I've spoken a lot, so yeah.
Thankfully, it's been great. So learned a lot. So thank you again for coming on. Thank you everybody for watching, presumably who's watching this. And yeah, let's see. I'll go ahead and I can get this to actually stop. So